August 6, 1942, Tokyo, Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters. The room is dimly lit, a haze of cigarette smoke curling toward the low ceiling. Maps of the Pacific archipelago stretch across polished oak tables, dotted with pins and handwritten coordinates. The hum of a single electric fan struggles against the summer heat, carrying the faint scent of ink and stale coffee. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto leans over a cluster of reports, eyes narrowing at the neatly typed numbers: aircraft losses, ship repairs, intercepted radio messages from American forces. Around him, other admirals, Nagumo, Kondo, Abe, exchange uneasy glances. The confident certainty that had gripped them in December 1941, when Pearl Harbor was struck, now seems fragile. Outside, the city is alive with the usual rhythm of wartime Tokyo. Factory sirens, marching soldiers, the distant thrum of naval vessels preparing in the harbor. Inside, the air is thick with a quiet dread. For the first time, some of Japan's most senior naval leaders sense a truth they cannot ignore. The audacious gamble of Pearl Harbor, meant to cripple the United States in one decisive strike, may have planted the seeds of Japan's own unraveling. A single telegram lies on the table, marked urgent. It is a warning, and the eyes of the admirals meet across the room. In this instant, history pivots. The confidence of December has dimmed, doubt has arrived, and the tide of war once thought conquered begins to whisper of a coming reckoning. The world outside continues, unaware. But inside these walls, a realization spreads like fire. The cost of Pearl Harbor may have been far greater than anyone anticipated. This moment, suspended between hubris and clarity, marks the day Japanese admirals first truly understood the fatal implications of their own strategy. By August 1942, the world was engulfed in a war unlike any before. The Pacific theater had erupted into a series of lightning campaigns, driven by Japan's ambition to dominate the region and secure vital resources. Less than 9 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had launched its audacious strike on Pearl Harbor. The attack had destroyed battleships, stunned the American public, and marked Japan's entry into full-scale conflict with the United States. In Tokyo and throughout the Japanese High Command, the mood had been triumphant. The planners believed that a decisive blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet would buy Japan the time and space to consolidate its growing empire in Southeast Asia. The initial months seemed to confirm this confidence. Japanese forces had swept through Malaya, capturing Singapore by February 1942, a victory that stunned the British Empire and earned Japan a reputation for tactical brilliance. Dutch East Indies, rich in oil and raw materials, fell swiftly, supplying the fuel Japan desperately needed to sustain its war machine. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces were overwhelmed, surrendering to the advancing Japanese army after months of desperate fighting. Across the Pacific, the illusion of Japanese invincibility seemed complete. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Pearl Harbor had indeed crippled much of the Pacific Fleet, but it had failed to destroy key American assets. Aircraft carriers, repair facilities, and fuel storage remained largely intact. U.S. forces, though stunned, quickly regrouped. Repair crews worked tirelessly at Pearl Harbor, salvaging damaged ships and restoring operational readiness. Simultaneously, intelligence operations began piecing together Japanese movements, with signals intercepts and code-breaking starting to reveal patterns that Japanese admirals could not yet fully see. By mid-1942, the war in the Pacific was evolving into a contest of attrition rather than one of rapid conquest. Japanese overextension became a critical concern. The vast distances between newly captured territories and Tokyo created logistical nightmares. Supply lines were stretched to breaking point, leaving garrisons in remote islands vulnerable. Aircraft carriers and battleships, the pride of the Imperial Navy, could no longer be concentrated in decisive strikes without exposing other fronts to risk. Even as Japan celebrated early victories, military planners began to sense that the United States, with its industrial might and vast manpower, was not defeated. The human cost of these campaigns was stark. Soldiers faced grueling marches through jungles and swamps, often in sweltering heat, while disease and malnutrition claimed as many lives as combat. Civilians in occupied territories endured harsh occupation policies, forced labor, and resource seizures. While victory parades were held in Tokyo, the reality of sustaining these conquests weighed heavily on those responsible for planning further operations. By August 1942, Japanese admirals were receiving reports that began to shift the narrative. U.S. carriers, unseen during Pearl Harbor, were now operational and active in the Pacific. Reinforcements were being shipped to strategic islands, and intelligence indicated that the Americans were improving both their aerial and naval capabilities at an unprecedented pace. The hubris of December 1941, when Japan believed a single strike could alter the course of the Pacific War, was giving way to a sobering awareness. Their victories were temporary, and the costs of overreach were mounting. Amid these pressures, key figures like Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, began to voice concerns that had been suppressed in the immediate aftermath of the strike. The Japanese Navy, while tactically proficient, faced a new strategic reality. America's capacity for recovery and counterattack was far greater than expected. Each victory now carried with it the shadow of potential retaliation, and every untested assumption from December's plans required re-evaluation. This moment of reckoning would not happen overnight. Yet, by early August 1942, it was clear to some of Japan's senior naval leadership that Pearl Harbor, while a remarkable tactical achievement, might have been a strategic miscalculation. The consequences of underestimating the United States' industrial and military resilience were beginning to surface. A storm was gathering on the horizon, a storm that would challenge Japanese naval doctrine, leadership confidence, and the very notion of victory in the Pacific. As the admirals prepared to receive further intelligence on the unfolding campaigns in the Solomon Islands and Midway, a quiet tension filled the rooms of the Imperial Navy headquarters. The world had changed since December 1941, and the calculations that had seemed flawless now demanded reconsideration. Each report, each telegram, each intercepted message was a piece of a puzzle that slowly revealed a painful truth. Japan's greatest gamble might have sown the seeds of its own undoing. By August 1942, the Japanese Imperial Navy faced a stark and unsettling reality. The initial victories after Pearl Harbor had created a false sense of invincibility, but the strategic landscape was shifting rapidly. In the Solomon Islands, American forces had begun to mount a counteroffensive, testing Japan's stretched supply lines and challenging the assumption that the Pacific was theirs to command. Guadalcanal, though only beginning to enter the strategic consciousness of Tokyo, would soon become the proving ground of Japan's overreach. Intelligence reports arriving at Imperial Navy headquarters painted a sobering picture. Radio intercepts revealed American naval movements, carriers that had survived December's attack now patrolling the Pacific with increasing boldness. Reconnaissance reports indicated that U.S. forces were actively repairing damaged bases and building new airfields, slowly eroding the advantage Japan had gained in the first months of war. The cumulative effect of these observations was undeniable. The United States was far from broken, and its industrial and logistical capacity was only beginning to be unleashed. Inside the war rooms, tension ran high. Admiral Nagumo, once the embodiment of precise and disciplined execution, began to voice concerns over the sustainability of Japan's aggressive expansion. Yamamoto, whose plan for Pearl Harbor had seemed flawless, found himself wrestling with the growing evidence that a single strike, however devastating, could not secure lasting strategic dominance. Communications with field commanders underscored the vulnerabilities in the Pacific. Isolated garrisons, overstretched supply chains, and a lack of reserves to respond to emerging American threats. The psychological weight of these realizations fell unevenly across the leadership. Some admirals remained convinced that the Americans, though resilient, could be contained through continued offensive pressure. Others, however, began to confront an uncomfortable truth. Pearl Harbor, rather than crippling the United States, had provoked it. The very act that was intended to buy Japan years of uncontested expansion had, in fact, awakened a sleeping giant. Every report of industrial output, every carrier spotted at sea, and every intercepted message reinforced a growing anxiety. The war was no longer a series of rapid conquests. It was evolving into a protracted struggle against a foe whose capacity to recover and strike back was underestimated. By early August, the Japanese admirals' confidence was eroding. Plans for further offensives, operations intended to secure key islands and protect vital resources, were now shadowed by caution. The fleet's focus began to shift from pure conquest to survivability and risk management. Intelligence officers presented analyses not only of enemy positions, but of the limits of Japanese capabilities, highlighting fuel shortages, maintenance bottlenecks, and the growing threat posed by American carrier aviation. Each document, each briefing, deepened the sense that December 7, 1941, while brilliant in execution, had set in motion forces Japan could no longer control. This was compounded by internal debate within the Navy. Yamamoto, known for his visionary strategies, now found himself mediating between aggressive commanders who favored continued offensive operations and cautious planners warning against overextension. Nagumo, whose attack on Pearl Harbor had earned both fame and infamy, began to see the limitations of decisive strikes without sustained support. Even Kondo, whose operational acumen had been trusted implicitly, recognized that Japan's current trajectory left the fleet vulnerable to counterattack. Amid these pressures, a critical realization began to crystallize. Pearl Harbor had not delivered the strategic knockout Japan had anticipated. The United States, far from being cowed, was mobilizing with a speed and scale that Japanese planners had underestimated. Every intercepted transmission, every naval sighting, every intelligence report added weight to a dawning consensus. The attack had been tactically brilliant, but strategically hazardous. Japan's leadership now confronted a sobering question that would dominate their deliberations in August 1942. Could the empire maintain the initiative, or had the first gamble already set the stage for a costly and protracted struggle? As the sun rose over Tokyo on August 6, 1942, the Imperial Navy's top admirals were left with an uncomfortable truth. The audacious gamble of Pearl Harbor, executed with precision and daring, had not secured the future they had imagined. Instead, it had awakened an industrial and military force far greater than anticipated. In the quiet of war rooms, amid maps, reports, and the hum of fans, the Japanese leadership began to confront the reality that would define the coming months. Pearl Harbor, their greatest triumph, may also have been their most dangerous mistake. This dawning clarity set the stage for the multiple angles through which we can examine the consequences, human, tactical, technological, and moral, that would shape the remainder of the Pacific War. On August 6, 1942, the human dimension of the Imperial Navy's awakening was unmistakable. Within the dimly lit war rooms of Tokyo, admirals and officers wrestled with the implications of Pearl Harbor. For the first time, doubt crept into minds that had previously known only certainty. Yamamoto, the architect of the December 7 strike, often described as calm and composed, now carried a weight that went beyond strategy. Reports of American recovery, glimpses of carrier movements, and intelligence on industrial output challenged not only his calculations but his personal confidence. Nagumo, who had commanded the Pearl Harbor strike force, experienced a unique psychological burden. Known for his meticulous planning and precise execution, he began questioning the broader strategic logic of their early victories. Diaries and later testimonies from Japanese officers reveal a pervasive tension. The same audacity that had fueled the attack now seemed to invite catastrophe. Each intercepted American message, each reconnaissance report of a repaired ship or operational airfield, served as a reminder that human overconfidence could be as lethal as enemy fire. The admirals' faces, stoic in public, concealed private anxieties, frustration, and the dawning realization that their decisions carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. Strategically, Pearl Harbor had been a stroke of tactical genius. Aircraft carriers struck with precision, battleships were immobilized, and American naval power was temporarily paralyzed. Yet by August 1942, the tactical gains were revealing hidden vulnerabilities. Japan's victories had been rapid, but they had stretched the fleet across thousands of miles of ocean, with minimal reserves. Each captured island required garrisons, supply chains, and constant naval protection, leaving Japan's carriers exposed to surprise attacks. Reports from the Solomon Islands showed that even a small American presence could threaten critical supply lines. Tactical doctrine that had relied on quick, decisive strikes was now confronting the reality of sustained operations over vast distances. The admirals were forced to consider that future engagements could no longer rely solely on audacity or numerical superiority in a single battle. The balance of firepower, speed of movement, and adaptability became central concerns. By August 6, the strategic calculus had shifted. A single bold operation could no longer guarantee lasting advantage. Survival and logistical management had become equally critical. Technological angle. Technology had been both Japan's greatest strength and emerging weakness. Aircraft carriers, dive bombers, and advanced torpedoes had enabled Pearl Harbor, proving the potency of modern naval warfare. Japanese precision in the early months of the war created the illusion that superior tactics and training could compensate for other vulnerabilities. Yet, by August 1942, the technological picture had begun to shift. Radar, previously underestimated by Japanese planners, was increasingly integrated into American defenses. Communications interception, code breaking, and the ability to track Japanese fleet movements introduced an element of unpredictability into Japan's operations. Aircraft maintenance and fuel shortages, often overlooked during the rapid conquests of early 1942, were now logistical bottlenecks. Even the formidable carriers and battleships required protection and repair, highlighting that technological superiority alone could not dictate the outcome of protracted engagements. Admirals began to realize that the tools that had enabled Pearl Harbor's success could also become liabilities if overstretched or countered by an adaptive enemy. By examining the human strain, the tactical recalibrations, and the technological realities confronting Japan in August 1942, a clearer picture emerges of why Pearl Harbor's initial brilliance began to show cracks. Confidence was eroded not by a single defeat, but by the cumulative weight of operational complexity, enemy resilience, and the human cost of overextension. This foundation prepares us to explore the second set of angles, leadership, enemy, and moral, where we see the strategic and ethical dimensions of Japan's realization in full force. Leadership in the Imperial Japanese Navy during August 1942 stood at a crossroads. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the intellectual force behind the Pearl Harbor strike, had always known that Japan's window for victory was narrow. Before the war, he had warned that Japan could dominate the Pacific for 6 months, perhaps a year, but beyond that, America's industrial power would prove overwhelming. His warning had been dismissed by nationalists and militarists eager for glory. Now, 8 months after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's prediction was coming true with painful precision. In meetings held within the Naval General Staff offices in Tokyo, Yamamoto's tone shifted from ambition to grim calculation. He was no longer discussing expansion, he was planning survival. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, once a symbol of operational confidence, began to show fatigue and doubt. His staff officers noticed the change. Where once he spoke of decisive victories, he now spoke of necessary defenses. The leadership circle that had once viewed the Pacific as an arena for swift dominance was now preoccupied with preserving dwindling strength. Even within the ranks, cracks appeared. Mid-level officers, trained to obey without question, began privately debating the strategic direction of the war. The Navy's younger generation, once inspired by the brilliance of Pearl Harbor, now faced the grim task of maintaining far-flung operations with limited resources. Leadership unity, which had once been Japan's greatest strength, began to dissolve into cautious pragmatism and internal doubt. Across the Pacific, the enemy Japan had hoped to cripple was awakening in full force. The United States Navy, driven by a mix of vengeance and resolve, was not only recovering, it was adapting. American shipyards, running day and night, repaired damaged vessels faster than Japan could have imagined. Aircraft carriers such as the Enterprise, Saratoga, and Hornet became floating symbols of American resurgence. By the summer of 1942, the US had learned the art of carrier warfare that Japan had once perfected. New tactics, improved radar systems, and long-range reconnaissance planes turned the ocean into a vast, interconnected battlefield. Japan's early edge in pilot training and combat coordination was gradually eroding as American pilots gained experience and confidence. The intelligence war also began tilting against Japan. American cryptographers, through code-breaking efforts such as MAGIC, began deciphering Japanese communications, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz an invaluable advantage. Every intercepted message reduced Japan's margin for surprise, and every engagement revealed that the Americans were learning faster than anticipated. From Tokyo's perspective, this transformation was startling. The enemy Japan had underestimated, viewed as emotionally fragile and industrially slow, was proving to be methodical, unrelenting, and fueled by industrial and psychological momentum. For the admirals reading intercepted reports of American counterattacks in the Solomon Islands, it became clear Pearl Harbor had not broken their opponent, it had forged him. Beneath the strategies and statistics lay a deeper, quieter reckoning. The moral dimension of Pearl Harbor, once celebrated as a righteous preemptive strike in Japan's eyes, began to haunt those who had planned it. Officers and strategists, faced with mounting losses and unending war, began to confront the ethical weight of their decision. In Japanese military culture, where honor and duty were inseparable, the idea of striking without declaration had been justified as necessary. But as months passed, and as the war expanded in brutality, a few within the naval leadership began to question the moral legitimacy of that choice. The attack had achieved short-term success, but at the cost of Japan's moral standing in the eyes of the world, and perhaps in their own. Even Yamamoto, though a loyal servant of his emperor, was known to have expressed private sorrow over the path Japan had taken. He had lived and studied in the United States and understood its people's willpower. Now, as American forces began to fight back with industrial fury and moral conviction, Japan faced an enemy fueled not only by retribution, but by purpose. In war councils and internal memos, a subtle shift in tone emerged. Discussions once dominated by strategy began to include reflections on sacrifice, endurance, and consequence. Officers began to understand that every victory carried a cost, not just in ships and lives, but in spirit. The moral burden of Pearl Harbor, its deception, its audacity, its failure to deliver peace through victory, lingered like a shadow over every subsequent decision. By August 6, 1942, these three angles, leadership uncertainty, enemy resurgence, and moral reckoning, converged into a single truth. Japan's admirals were no longer merely managing a war, they were managing the consequences of their own ambition. The brilliance of Pearl Harbor had faded, replaced by the sobering reality of a long, grinding conflict. Every map, every briefing, every whispered conversation carried the same unspoken question: had the strike that once defined Japan's power also sealed its fate? And soon, an event would force that question into the open, a turning point that would change the course of the Pacific War and confirm the fears already echoing through Tokyo's war rooms. August 6, 1942, Tokyo, Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters. The telegram arrived just after dawn. It bore the seal of the Imperial Navy's combined fleet and carried a short, chilling message from the forward area. Enemy landing reported on Guadalcanal. Strength unknown. Airfield construction halted. Request immediate reinforcements. In that moment, the room fell silent. The admirals exchanged glances heavy with the weight of recognition. The Americans had landed, not in some peripheral outpost, but on a strategically vital island deep within Japan's defensive perimeter. It was the first large-scale Allied offensive in the Pacific. For the Japanese Admiralty, the realization was immediate and profound. The tide of war had turned. For months, the Japanese Navy had dominated the Pacific, dictating when and where battles were fought. But now, on August 6, 1942, control was slipping away. Reports flooding in from Rabaul and Truk confirmed the presence of U.S. Marines on Guadalcanal. Worse still, reconnaissance suggested the Americans were establishing a base that could threaten Japan's vital supply routes through the Solomon Sea. What had begun as an isolated report quickly crystallized into a strategic crisis. Admiral Yamamoto's staff began assembling operational data, but the numbers were stark. Japan's frontline carrier force, once unmatched, was severely depleted after the Battle of Midway just 2 months earlier. 4 of its 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Their loss had gutted Japan's ability to project air power at the scale needed to repel such an offensive. Pilots lost at Midway were irreplaceable, their experience unmatched by newer recruits. Now, as American forces dug in on Guadalcanal, Yamamoto's fleet lacked both the ships and the trained crews necessary to respond with overwhelming force. The admirals convened an emergency meeting. Around the table sat Nagumo, Kondo, and Ugaki, veterans of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea. They listened as intelligence officers laid out the situation. The Americans had landed unopposed, and construction on Henderson Field, an unfinished Japanese airstrip, had already resumed under U.S. engineers. Within weeks, American bombers could threaten every convoy and supply line across the Solomons. Yamamoto's reaction was measured but grave. He understood the implications better than anyone. The very initiative Japan had fought so hard to maintain since December 1941 was slipping away, not through defeat in a single battle, but through the slow, methodical advance of an enemy that refused to collapse. The realization that Pearl Harbor's promise of strategic dominance was unraveling was now undeniable. Admiral Nagumo, his face drawn and voice subdued, broke the silence. "If we do not drive them out now, we lose the Solomon Islands," he said. "If we lose the Solomons, we lose the South Seas, and if we lose the South Seas..." He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the conclusion: Japan would lose the war of attrition. The fleet was ordered to prepare an immediate counteroffensive. Destroyers, cruisers, and carriers remaining in the area began mobilizing under what would soon become known as the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Yet even as orders were issued, many in Tokyo knew the truth. Japan no longer possessed the resources for sustained offensive warfare. The admirals were caught between pride and pragmatism, compelled to strike, but haunted by the knowledge that every engagement now carried irreversible cost. Reports continued to pour in. American aircraft were sighted over Tulagi. Japanese convoys carrying reinforcements were harassed by submarines. The speed and coordination of the U.S. response shocked many in the high command. How had a nation so devastated 8 months earlier risen so quickly to challenge them again? The answer was in the very essence of the Pearl Harbor miscalculation. Japan had never understood the scale of America's industrial and psychological resilience. For Yamamoto, the moment was deeply personal. He had once written to a colleague that he would run wild for 6 months after war began, but beyond that, he could guarantee nothing. Now, in August 1942, those 6 months had passed, and his prophecy had come true with haunting accuracy. Outside, Tokyo carried on with the rituals of wartime life, propaganda broadcasts, victory speeches, and patriotic marches. But inside the halls of Naval Command, a different atmosphere prevailed, quiet, restrained, and grim. Officers who had once celebrated the Pearl Harbor victory now studied casualty lists and repair logs. The fleet that had seemed invincible was fragmenting, its logistical arteries strained to the breaking point. The reports from Guadalcanal continued to grow darker. By nightfall, Japanese destroyers were already engaged in chaotic skirmishes off the island's coast. American anti-aircraft fire illuminated the tropical sky. The once clear vision of a Pacific empire now seemed blurred, obscured by smoke, fatigue, and the mounting realization that Japan's enemies had found their footing. For Japan's admirals, August 6, 1942, was not marked by explosions or spectacle. It was marked by silence, the quiet recognition that the war they had unleashed was shifting beyond their control. The telegram on the table symbolized more than a military setback. It was the confirmation of Yamamoto's greatest fear. Pearl Harbor had awakened the enemy, but it had also doomed Japan's hopes of swift victory. The next days would bring frantic decisions, desperate battles, and the irreversible descent into a war Japan could no longer win. August 7, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. At dawn, the horizon burned orange. The stillness of the Pacific was shattered by the thunder of naval guns. From battleships offshore, shells screamed overhead and crashed into the dense jungles of Guadalcanal. The earth trembled. The first major American amphibious landing of the Pacific War had begun. As the bombardment lifted, waves of U.S. Marines stormed ashore. They were young, untested men, many seeing combat for the first time, yet their orders were clear: seize the unfinished Japanese airstrip and hold it at all costs. Within hours, they encountered sporadic enemy resistance. By nightfall, they had captured the airfield, which would soon be named Henderson Field, in honor of a fallen pilot from Midway. It was a small victory on a map dominated by ocean, but it marked a colossal turning point in the Pacific War. News of the American landings reached Tokyo in fragments, confusing, contradictory, but unmistakably grim. Admiral Yamamoto's staff confirmed that the U.S. now held a forward base less than 600 miles from Rabaul. For Japan, Guadalcanal was not merely a military setback, it was a symbol of fading dominance. For the first time, the Empire of Japan was being invaded. In Rabaul, Vice Admiral Junichi Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet, was ordered to strike back immediately. That night, August 8, he assembled a task force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer. His objective was to annihilate the Allied invasion fleet in Ironbottom Sound. Mikawa's fleet moved swiftly through the moonless waters. At 1:43 a.m. on August 9, lookouts aboard the heavy cruiser Chokai spotted silhouettes on the horizon. The Allied fleet anchored off Savo Island. The Japanese formation, illuminated by flares and searchlights, opened fire with deadly precision. Shells and torpedoes ripped through the darkness. The Battle of Savo Island had begun. Within minutes, chaos engulfed the Allied ships. The American cruisers Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes were hit in rapid succession, burning fiercely. The Australian cruiser Canberra was also struck and disabled. The surprise was total. Mikawa's night-fighting tactics, perfected through years of training, decimated the unprepared Allied task force. By dawn, 4 heavy cruisers lay at the bottom of Ironbottom Sound, and over 1,000 sailors were dead. It was, tactically, one of Japan's most brilliant victories of the war, yet strategically, it was a hollow one. Mikawa, fearing daylight air attacks from U.S. carriers, withdrew before destroying the vulnerable American transports anchored offshore. That single decision, to retreat rather than finish the job, sealed Japan's fate on Guadalcanal. When dawn broke on August 9, the battered American invasion fleet remained intact. Supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements continued to pour ashore. The Marines, shaken but determined, dug deeper into the jungle, fortifying Henderson Field. From that day forward, the island became a fortress, one that would bleed Japan's Navy, Army, and Air Force for the next 6 months. The Japanese High Command could not yet comprehend it, but Guadalcanal had become the graveyard of the Imperial Navy. In Tokyo, Yamamoto received word of Mikawa's victory and his retreat. The admiral's face remained unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. He knew that the enemy now held a permanent foothold, one Japan would never fully dislodge. Every attempt to retake the island would drain the empire's strength. By mid-August, the Americans had begun launching daily air raids from Henderson Field. Japanese transports carrying reinforcements were attacked relentlessly. Convoys were forced to sail at night, slipping through the narrow channels under cover of darkness. This desperate nightly supply effort became known among Japanese sailors as the Tokyo Express. Each run was a gamble. Every night, destroyers carried men and supplies to Guadalcanal, and every morning, American aircraft hunted them down. The attrition was brutal. For every ton of supplies the Japanese managed to deliver, the Americans could land 10. Meanwhile, in Washington and Pearl Harbor, the mood was shifting. For the first time since 1941, the United States had seized the initiative. President Roosevelt, briefed daily on the battle, understood its symbolic power. Guadalcanal was not just an island, it was a test of endurance, a proving ground for America's new kind of warfare, long-range, logistics-driven, industrially sustained. By contrast, Japan's war machine was unraveling. Oil reserves were dwindling. Pilot losses at Midway had crippled carrier strength. Every replacement aircraft meant diverting precious steel from shipbuilding. The Empire's vast perimeter, stretching from the Aleutians to New Guinea, could no longer be defended in full. Yet Tokyo refused to concede. Imperial army leaders demanded counterattacks. Thousands of soldiers were thrown into suicidal assaults on the marine perimeter around Henderson Field. The jungle became a nightmare, heat, disease, and hunger, claiming as many lives as bullets. Bodies were buried hastily or left unburied under the thick canopy. Guadalcanal, once envisioned as a stepping stone toward Australia, was now consuming the very army meant to defend the empire. In September 1942, Japanese carriers Shikaku and Zuikaku clashed again with U.S. forces at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The engagement ended in stalemate, but Japan's pilot losses deepened the crisis. The Americans, with endless industrial backing, replaced planes and crews within weeks. Japan could not. For every ship Japan lost, the U.S. launched 2 more. For every pilot killed, America trained 10. The balance that had seemed so secure after Pearl Harbor was gone forever. By October, even Yamamoto's optimism had faded. Reports from the front described starving troops, failed offensives, and mounting desertions. The once proud Imperial Navy was stretched thin, its ships scattered across an ocean it could no longer command. And yet orders continued: hold Guadalcanal, no withdrawal permitted. In Tokyo's war rooms, maps of the Pacific were covered in red pins, each representing another convoy lost, another airfield bombed, another base falling silent. The empire that had surged outward in 1941 was now bleeding from within. On the island itself, the American flag flew over Henderson Field, fluttering in the humid wind. Beneath it, Marines prepared for the next assault, unaware that their small patch of jungle had already rewritten the course of the Pacific War. Guadalcanal had become the line that divided the empire that was from the empire that would never be again. Late 1942, Rabaul Naval Base, New Britain. The war had turned, and Yamamoto knew it. He stood on the pier as another destroyer limped into harbor, its decks scarred, its crew silent. The once proud Imperial Navy, whose fleets had sailed triumphantly across the Pacific less than a year earlier, was now a shadow of its former self. Oil-stained uniforms, exhausted sailors, dwindling morale, this was the new face of Japan's naval power. Every day new reports arrived from Guadalcanal. Severe losses, convoy intercepted, reinforcements delayed. The Tokyo Express had become a nightly death sentence. Ships were sunk faster than they could be replaced, and the island, that cursed jungle, was devouring men and machines alike. By November 1942, Yamamoto ordered one last desperate effort to turn the tide, an operation to crush the American foothold once and for all. The plan called for a massive naval engagement, the naval battle of Guadalcanal. It began on November 12, under a moonless sky. Japanese battleships Hiei and Kirishima, accompanied by cruisers and destroyers, steamed toward Iron Bottom Sound. Their mission: bombard Henderson Field and annihilate the American forces ashore. But waiting in the dark waters ahead was the U.S. Navy, weary, battered, but unyielding. At 1:24 a.m., radar screens aboard U.S. ships flickered to life. Blips appeared, enemy vessels, closing fast. What followed was one of the most chaotic and brutal close-range naval battles in modern history. Searchlights cut through the blackness. Shells screamed across the sea. Ships collided at point-blank range, exchanging broadsides so fierce that even steel hulls glowed red-hot. The American destroyer Laffey was riddled with shells but rammed a Japanese ship before sinking. The San Francisco was nearly destroyed, yet its gunners kept firing until their ammunition ran out. By dawn, both fleets were crippled, but Hiei, the pride of the Japanese battleship line, was dead in the water. American aircraft from Henderson Field swooped in at sunrise, turning the massive warship into a burning wreck. She sank later that evening, the first Japanese battleship lost in the war. The shock was immediate. For the first time, Japan's mighty surface fleet had been decisively beaten in a direct engagement, but worse was yet to come. 2 nights later, the Japanese returned for revenge. The Second Battle of Guadalcanal began on November 14. Battleship Kirishima and her escort clashed with the American battleships Washington and South Dakota. The duel was short but devastating. Using radar-directed gunfire, a new and terrifying innovation, Washington struck Kirishima repeatedly, crippling her. The Japanese battleship burned until dawn before rolling over and sinking beneath the waves. It was the end of Japan's illusion of naval invincibility. In the following weeks, American control of the air and sea around Guadalcanal became absolute. Japanese supply lines collapsed. Starving troops on the island fought on, but their fate was sealed. By early 1943, the Imperial High Command made a decision it had once deemed unthinkable: evacuation. Operation Key, the withdrawal of all remaining Japanese forces from Guadalcanal, began in February 1943. It was carried out in secret, under the cover of night, using destroyers and submarines. Tens of thousands of soldiers were left behind, their grave lost in the jungle mud. When the last evacuation ship slipped away, Yamamoto received the coded message confirming the island's abandonment. He placed the telegram on his desk, studied it in silence, and said quietly to his aide, "We have lost Guadalcanal. It is the beginning of the end." It was the only time his staff saw him visibly broken. That night he walked alone along the shoreline of Rabaul. The sea breeze carried the distant echo of engines, the rhythmic pounding of surf, and the faint cries of wounded men from the hospitals nearby. Above him, the southern stars burned coldly, the same stars that had guided his fleet at Pearl Harbor. But now they looked different. The realization was inescapable. The strategy that had once seemed so perfect, the daring strike on Pearl Harbor meant to paralyze the U.S., had achieved the opposite. America had not been crippled, it had been awakened. Its factories roared to life, its carriers filled the seas, and its determination hardened into steel. Japan had bought 6 months of victory and an eternity of consequences. In the months following Guadalcanal, Yamamoto's role grew increasingly ceremonial. His plans were often overruled by army leadership, who clung to delusions of renewed offensives. The Navy's resources were drained. Aircraft carriers like Shikaku and Zuikaku operated with skeleton air groups. Fuel shortages crippled fleet maneuvers. The empire was dying, not with explosions, but with exhaustion. And yet Yamamoto continued to lead, not out of hope, but out of duty. He began a morale tour across the Solomon Islands to inspect bases and rally troops. It was a dangerous journey, and one the Americans soon discovered through decrypted communications. On April 18, 1943, a squadron of US P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville. In a brief, precise ambush, they shot him down. His plane crashed into the jungle. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had both predicted Japan's temporary triumph and foreseen its ultimate ruin, was dead. When his body was recovered, Yamamoto was still seated, his sword at his side, his gloved hand clutching the hilt. The pilot's watch on his wrist had stopped at 9:34 a.m. In Tokyo, the news was announced with solemn reverence. Newspapers hailed him as a martyr. The emperor ordered a state funeral, but in the quiet corridors of the Navy Ministry, there was no celebration, only the silent acknowledgement that the man who had warned of the sleeping giant had been right all along. Guadalcanal, Midway, the long string of losses, all of it traced back to a single, fateful decision made in late 1941. The strike on Pearl Harbor, once hailed as Japan's greatest victory, had instead sealed the empire's destiny. And on August 6, 1942, that humid summer day when the Admirals gathered in Tokyo, they had already begun to feel it. The creeping sense of doom, the weight of a war they could no longer win. The empire that had sought to dominate the Pacific now stood on the edge of collapse. The tide had turned, not with a single battle, but with the slow realization of inevitability. From that day forward, Japan was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting to delay defeat. February 1943, Tokyo, Japan. The telegram announcing the evacuation of Guadalcanal arrived in silence. There were no public declarations, no official statements, no victory parades. In the heart of the Imperial Navy headquarters, the news spread quietly, passed from hand to hand, each officer reading the coded message and understanding what it meant without a single word spoken. The unthinkable had happened. Japan had lost an island. It was the first time since 1937, since the empire's march through China and Southeast Asia, that a major Japanese force had been forced to retreat. Guadalcanal, once envisioned as the southern anchor of Japan's Pacific Wall, was gone. In Tokyo, the government disguised the defeat as a strategic withdrawal, but within the Navy there was no illusion. The truth was bitter. The loss of Guadalcanal marked the beginning of Japan's collapse as a maritime power. The statistics told the story mercilessly. Over 24,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. Thousands more perished from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Nearly 700 aircraft and 24 warships were lost in the campaign. The Americans, though bloodied, could replace their losses within months. Japan could not. Factories in Nagoya, Yokosuka, and Kure struggled to replace even the simplest equipment. Shortages of aluminum, rubber, and oil crippled aircraft production. Naval engineers began dismantling older ships to salvage spare parts. Pilots trained with wooden propellers and fuel substitutes. The empire was running on fumes. For the Imperial Army, Guadalcanal was more than a battlefield defeat. It was a blow to the national psyche. The myth of Japanese invincibility, nurtured since the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, had been shattered. Soldiers who once believed themselves the heirs of samurai tradition now whispered doubts. If America could take Guadalcanal, what could stop them from coming for the rest? In March 1943, the despair deepened. At the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, U.S. aircraft annihilated a Japanese troop convoy attempting to reinforce New Guinea. 8 transports and 4 destroyers were sunk. More than 3,000 men were killed. The ocean, once Japan's domain, had become its graveyard. From this point onward, Japan was no longer on the offensive. Every campaign that followed, the Aleutians, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, became a desperate defense, a slow retreat toward the home islands. Inside Japan, the civilian population began to feel the weight of war. Food was rationed, fuel became scarce. Cities like Osaka and Tokyo experienced the first small-scale air raids, yet propaganda continued to promise victory. Newspapers spoke of glorious sacrifices and temporary setbacks, but the men in the war rooms knew better. In mid-1943, Admiral Mainichi Koga succeeded the late Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. He inherited a navy gutted by losses and plagued by low morale. Koga understood that Japan could no longer match America in open battle. His only hope was attrition, to bleed the U.S. Navy through costly defensive operations. But attrition required resources Japan no longer had. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States was awakening into full-scale war industry. Shipyards in San Francisco, Seattle, and Norfolk produced a new aircraft carrier every few months. Liberty ships, cargo vessels built in record time, filled the oceans with supplies. The U.S. was becoming what Yamamoto had feared most, an industrial juggernaut. In the skies, American aircraft grew deadlier. The new F-6F Hellcat outperformed nearly every Japanese fighter. The B-24 Liberator and B-25 Mitchell extended bombing range across the Pacific. By the end of 1943, Japan's air superiority had evaporated. And then came Operation Cartwheel, the Allied campaign to isolate and neutralize Rabaul, the fortress city that had once served as Japan's main base in the South Pacific. Rather than attacking it directly, the Allies bypassed it, cutting off its supply lines and leaving it to wither in isolation. It was a strategic masterpiece, and another silent defeat for Japan. By early 1944, Rabaul's airfields were deserted. Its harbor, once filled with warships, now held rusting hulks. Thousands of soldiers remained trapped, forgotten by the empire they had served. Back in Tokyo, the Admiralty convened in grim resignation. Reports from the front painted the same picture: shrinking territory, failing morale, increasing desertion. The empire's vast defensive ring was collapsing inward. Every island captured by the Allies became a stepping stone toward Japan itself. The seeds of Pearl Harbor's ambition to destroy American resolve had instead grown into an unstoppable storm, and the Admirals, who once toasted victory in December 1941, now sat in silence, staring at maps that no longer promised glory but foretold ruin. Their enemy had adapted, their empire had not. And as they studied the lines of red ink marking lost bases and broken fleets, one truth became undeniable. Japan had awakened the sleeping giant, and now it was paying the price. Mid-1944, the empire in retreat. The Pacific now belonged to the Americans. By the summer of 1944, the balance of power had not just shifted, it had collapsed entirely. Japan's once mighty combined fleet was scattered and starving for fuel. Her airfields were silent, her carriers stripped of planes. The grand empire, built on conquest and audacity, was shrinking beneath the relentless advance of Allied power. It began with the Mariana Islands. In June 1944, U.S. forces landed on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, islands that were, in the eyes of Tokyo, sacred extensions of the homeland itself. The Japanese High Command committed everything they had to the defense. It became one of the bloodiest battles of the war. When American forces finally took Saipan on July 9, the psychological impact was catastrophic. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned. The Japanese people, for the first time, realized that defeat was not only possible, it was inevitable. But the true disaster unfolded at sea. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought between June 19 and 20, 1944, was Japan's last major carrier battle. The Imperial Navy deployed 9 carriers and over 400 aircraft. The Americans brought 15 carriers and nearly 900 planes. The result was a massacre. Poorly trained Japanese pilots, many with fewer than 100 hours of flight experience, flew into the deadly wall of American anti-aircraft fire and radar-controlled fighters. The sky became a slaughterhouse. So many Japanese planes were shot down that U.S. pilots grimly nicknamed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days, Japan lost over 300 aircraft and 3 carriers. The Imperial Navy's carrier force, the same weapon that had struck Pearl Harbor with such precision, ceased to exist as an effective fighting arm. After the battle, Japanese commanders radioed Tokyo. "The air is no longer ours." From that moment on, Japan's war became one of survival. As the Americans advanced westward, the strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands began. The new B-29 superfortress, operating from captured bases in the Marianas, could reach Tokyo itself. For the first time in centuries, the heart of Japan was under direct attack. Night after night, the sky above Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya burned. The bombings were not just military operations, they were industrial and psychological warfare. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash. Civilians dug shelters beneath their homes. Millions fled to the countryside. The once proud imperial capital became a city of ruins and smoke. Meanwhile, the Imperial Navy fought its last great battle and its final tragedy at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. It was the largest naval engagement in history. Desperate to stop the American landings in the Philippines, Japan threw everything it had left into the fight. Carriers used as decoys, battleships sent on suicide charges, and pilots ordered to crash into enemy ships. It was during this campaign that Japan unleashed its most haunting weapon, the kamikaze. Young men, barely out of training, climbed into aircraft loaded with explosives and launched themselves into American ships. Their missions were framed as acts of divine sacrifice, but in reality, they were the measure of a nation out of options. At Leyte and later at Okinawa, thousands of kamikazes died. Hundreds of American ships were hit, but no amount of sacrifice could change the outcome. Japan had already lost the war of production, of fuel, of time. By 1945, the empire had become a fortress surrounded by fire. The Philippines were gone. Iwo Jima had fallen. Okinawa, Japan's last defensive outpost, was captured in June. American bombers now roamed freely over the homeland. The Navy was finished. Its few surviving ships sat rusting in harbors. The army, starving and undersupplied, could barely function. The skis belonged entirely to the enemy. And then came the final blow, August 6, 1945. 3 years to the day after that fateful morning in 1942, when Japan's admirals had first sensed their fatal mistake, a single American bomber, the Enola Gay, flew over the city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. A blinding flash, a cloud rising higher than mountains. In seconds, an entire city was erased. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people for the first time in history. His voice, trembling and distant through the radio static, announced the unthinkable: surrender. In that moment, the war and the empire ended. For the admirals who survived, it was not just a military defeat, but a spiritual reckoning. The same men who had once celebrated Pearl Harbor in triumph now watched as their nation burned. The dream of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere had dissolved into ruins and hunger. In the end, Yamamoto's prophecy had come true in every word. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical masterpiece and a strategic catastrophe. And on August 6, 1942, when the first flicker of doubt appeared in the eyes of Japan's admirals, the future had already been written. The empire that soared on the wings of audacity was destined to fall by the weight of its own illusion. By the time the guns fell silent around Tulagi and the smoke cleared over Henderson Field, the Japanese High Command was no longer fighting for expansion. They were fighting to delay the inevitable. The Imperial Navy's reports arrived in Tokyo, detailing the loss of 8 transports, the crippling of surface escorts, and the death of hundreds of experienced soldiers. But worse than numbers was the psychological shift. For the first time since 1937, Japan was reacting, not acting. The offensive spirit that had carried them across Asia was broken. Rear Admiral Mato Mugaki wrote in his diary on August 20, "Our losses are heavy. Guadalcanal appears to be a long struggle. The enemy is strong and resolute." That simple line spoke volumes. For officers raised in the belief of Japan's divine destiny, this was an unthinkable admission. The American seizure of Guadalcanal forced Japan into a logistical nightmare. Supply convoys, what the Americans mockingly called the Tokyo Express, were hunted nightly by U.S. destroyers and submarines. Each trip cost ships, fuel, and men. Tokyo's once mighty navy was bleeding slowly, not through decisive battles, but through exhaustion. By November 1942, just 3 months after the first landings, Japanese soldiers on the island were reduced to starvation. Disease claimed more lives than bullets. Rice rations fell from 400 grams a day to just 50. Men ate grass, tree bark, and whatever they could scavenge. Some Japanese diaries record men whispering the same phrase before death: "We were abandoned by the gods." In contrast, the Americans built an empire of efficiency on that island. Airfields expanded, artillery was entrenched, and supply lines strengthened daily. Guadalcanal became the model for U.S. island warfare: secure the air, build forward bases, and grind the enemy down with relentless logistics. By February 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy authorized evacuation. Operation Key, as they called it, was a bitter retreat masked as a tactical redeployment. Under cover of darkness, Japanese destroyers slipped past American lines to rescue the remnants of their army. 10,000 survivors out of 36,000 made it off the island alive. The rest lay buried beneath its jungles, silent proof of a fading empire. Guadalcanal's outcome was more than a territorial loss. It was the death of Japan's maritime supremacy. The Imperial Navy could no longer replace the pilots and ships lost in those months. Carrier air crews, the veterans of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, were gone. Their replacements were poorly trained, untested, and increasingly outmatched by American technology. In the halls of the Naval General Staff, somber discussions began. Officers debated whether Japan could sustain another year of full-scale war. Admiral Yamamoto himself, though still outwardly confident, began to show signs of fatigue and doubt. He once said quietly to his staff, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant." Guadalcanal had proved those words prophetic. The psychological wound ran deep. Newspapers in Tokyo still printed tales of heroic resistance, but the people knew the truth. For the first time, Japan's war machine seemed human, vulnerable, and uncertain. The aura of invincibility, born at Pearl Harbor, had evaporated over the jungles of the Solomon Islands. American morale, meanwhile, soared. Guadalcanal became a rallying cry, proof that the Japanese could be beaten, that the tide of war could turn. Roosevelt called it a turning point in the Pacific. For the men who fought there, it was something even more profound, a baptism by fire. In the end, August 6, 1942, was not merely the day Japan's admirals realized their mistake. It was the moment the entire Pacific War changed direction. From that day forward, Japan would never again win a major offensive battle. Every step eastward became a retreat, slow, bloody, and inevitable. And yet, in the silence after Guadalcanal, one truth lingered among those who had seen Pearl Harbor's triumph. The same brilliance that had brought Japan to war had also blinded it. The empire had gambled everything on surprise and shock, but wars, history proved, are not won in moments of glory. They are won in the grind that follows. From the waters of Iron Bottom Sound to the skis over Henderson Field, that truth echoed through every wreck, every grave, every lost soul of the Pacific. Guadalcanal had begun as a small island of little importance, but it ended as the place where an empire's fate was sealed. And from here, the story of Japan's long descent, from dominance to desperation, would only deepen. The war was far from over, but the illusion of victory was gone. History remembers the great battles by their victories, Pearl Harbor, Midway, Normandy, but it remembers Guadalcanal for its revelation. It was not the largest, nor the most technologically advanced, nor the bloodiest, yet it was where the direction of an entire world war quietly turned. For Japan, August 6, 1942, marked the beginning of an awakening, the slow realization that courage alone cannot defy industrial might. The empire had believed that spirit, discipline, and sacrifice could overcome any enemy, but Guadalcanal exposed the new reality of modern war. Logistics, endurance, and production would decide everything. In Tokyo's naval circles, the admirals no longer spoke of swift victories. They spoke of holding what we have. They had seen their invincible carriers struck down, their elite aviators gone, their fuel lines cut. They now understood that the strike at Pearl Harbor, once hailed as Japan's moment of genius, had set into motion a chain of events that would eventually consume them. Across the ocean, in the United States, the same realization dawned in reverse. Guadalcanal proved to the Americans that they could win, not just survive, but advance, island by island, toward the heart of the empire that had once seemed unstoppable. From that point onward, every map of the Pacific changed color slowly, almost inevitably. The Japanese sun began to set, replaced by the rising machinery of American war power. But beyond the strategy and numbers lies a deeper truth. On that island, amid mud, disease, and endless rain, two nations discovered their limits. One learned that pride without foresight leads to ruin. The other learned that victory demands patience, sacrifice, and the will to endure. By war's end, the admirals who once celebrated Pearl Harbor would look back not at December 7, 1941, but at August 6, 1942, as the day their empire's fate was sealed. Because on that day, in the quiet jungles of Guadalcanal, the Japanese Navy realized the truth history never lets anyone forget.